Right, so today I wanted to make this video about a topic that I think needs to get talked about a lot more. I would say it's arguably the least talked about, very important issue that's out there nowadays, and that's child abuse and the implications of it, and why we need to be teaching and promoting more peaceful forms of parenting. And I think just for starters, I think the main reason that it's not talked about more is that it's very uncomfortable. Number one, for to admit that stuff has happened to you in your past, and it's a lot more people than one would think. And I think the bigger one is that you to figure these issues out, you need to confront your parents and your grandparents on their past and them raising you in your past, and that's extremely uncomfortable for people, and it's extremely uncomfortable for the parents and the grandparents, and they generally don't want to talk about it, and they'll often neglect you or abuse you if you want to talk about it. So I think that's the main reason it's not talked about. But I just wanted to get into a few stats here, and I think that if any, these are U.S. stats, so these aren't even worldwide or anything. But um, and this is in 2008, so this numbers I assume is quite a bit higher now. Obviously, 11 years later, but uh, this estimates that when you combine loss of worker productivity, healthcare costs, special ed costs, child welfare expenditures, criminal justice expenditures added up to $124 billion dollars, and that's huge. And they basically say that could send 1.7 million kids to college. And I think that the price of college would go down if child abuse was brought down for a few reasons, but that's a different video for a different day. But that's a staggering number. And the next one here is that 1,580 children died. So that's between 4 and 5 a day. So I mean, you think of it, every 4 to 6 hours, a kid died on average because of child abuse, basically. Um, and this was probably the most telling stat, I think, is that children who experience child abuse and neglect are 9 times more likely to be involved in criminal activity. So that's huge. And the other thing, too, that I would mention is that I'm not sure if they mentioned it here, is that um, they don't really mention it here, or if they do, I'm missing it. But it doesn't necessarily need to be physical or sexual or something along those lines. This is something that gets brought up a lot too when you talk about this issue, is that people say, well, oh, your abuse wasn't that bad. It wasn't physical or it wasn't sexual. But studies basically show that neglect or emotional abuse can and oftentimes has just as much or the exact same implications as physical or sexual abuse. So that's not a really an excuse. But getting right into the main topic is that peaceful parenting. I think that's arguably the biggest thing that society could do that would change society for the better nowadays. And that's for just to put it in most basic terms, is that if you're raised peacefully and you, rather than, let's say your parent wants you to do something, you want to do it differently, and it just being do it this way because I'm the parent. Well, what that teaches kids is that if you want to get your way, number one, you need to have more power over the other person, and number two is that if you have that power, well, then you can get your way and you can do whatever you want. And the biggest implication is that um, negotiating when you have a disagreement doesn't mean anything. And that's one of the biggest problems in society nowadays, is people want to solve all their problems through violence or the threat of violence. I mean, taxation, basically almost every financial thing nowadays is funded through taxation, which is violence or the threat of violence, right? So if we want to move forward as a society, we need to raise kids peacefully and we need to negotiate with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that um, kids are going to get their way all the time. I mean, most of the time the parent's still going to have the better argument, right? Because they should know more. But um, you want to teach your kid that if they can come up with a better argument for something they want that maybe you don't want them to have, or do it this particular way, that they get their way. And the reason why that's important is because what that'll teach them is that using your words and your brain basically to figure out issues in society or issues in your personal life is more effective than using violence, the threat of violence, or anything along those lines. And that's about the most basic way of putting it. And the big problem with that is that most people weren't raised this way, and they have the whole well, I was raised that way and I turned out all right mentality. So then they just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. With it's been happening generation over generation now. And like I said, one of the big reasons why people don't want to change is that would require them to confront parents and grandparents about their past and their own past. So that's extremely uncomfortable for everyone involved, and people just don't want to do it. And a lot of times people aren't even, I would say that a majority of the population, well, maybe not a majority, but a big part of the population isn't even intelligent enough to recognize this problem. So I mean, it doesn't even register in their mind. And then there's the big part of the population that has the whole, well, I was raised that way and I turned out all right mantra, and they don't realize that, yeah, you maybe turned out all right, but you could have been a lot better. And not only that, society would be a lot better as a whole, because maybe you were okay, but the next guy wasn't, or the next girl wasn't. And this is also very big in that if you look at like very infamous serial killers in the U.S. mainly, they all had very rough childhoods in which a lot of times they were abused. There was a lot of, you look at a lot of the worst serial killers, a lot of them were, they didn't live up to the image that maybe their parents wanted them to have, and they were neglected and talked down to for that kind of stuff. A lot of times they grew up in an environment to where, like I said, negotiating was a non-starter at all. It was just do things this way. I'm your parent, listen to me, kind of thing. That's about all I wanted to talk about for this video. Like I said, I think it's the biggest problem that no one's talking about. And the reason no one's really talking about it when it comes to the political realm is that the left doesn't talk about it because they make money and they get elected off this kind of stuff, right? Like, if people were smart and were taught to negotiate for what they wanted, well, then the left's whole political platform in that let's raise taxes is free healthcare, or I mean, it's not free, it's just subsidized, but subsidized healthcare, welfare, higher taxes, all that stuff, the stuff that the left wants. I mean, they don't want to talk about it because then people would be more likely to question that and to recognize the immorality and the unethicalness of doing things that way. And the right doesn't do it because the right tends to have the pathological self-doubt that usually loses them elections, and that someone will call you racist or sexist and they'll just shut right up. So that's again, it's a bit of a different topic. I didn't want to get too into the political realm as far as this video goes, but if you liked it, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.